Hi, everybody. Welcome to the, what month it is, July edition of ChangeMakers on Tuesdays. We've got a small, intimate crowd by the look of it this month. There might be some people joining us after they've made their lunch, perhaps. But we'll kick off. Clearly, we need to spread the word about the fantastic initiative that is ChangeMakers on Tuesdays. But we'd like to open the meeting by acknowledging the traditional owners from the lands on wherever we're meeting from around the country today. A great NAIDOC week, although a bit subdued with all the lockdowns last week. But ending on a highlight with Ash Barty winning Wimbledon, that was fairly cool. Ash lives at Ipswich, not too far from where I'm sitting. So it's a bit along like both those Australian-New Zealand things where we claim New Zealand successes as our own. So we claim her as a Logan success because she's 20 minutes up the road. Anyway, so welcome everybody. If you'd like to acknowledge the lands that you're joining us from, just drop that in the chat and we'll get underway. So this month's guest speaker is Adrian Pisarski. Adrian's the Executive Officer at National Shelter. What we talked about at our last event in May was topics that people wanted to hear more about, and the housing affordability crisis was the most popular topic. So we're very pleased to have Adrian join us to discuss housing affordability. Welcome, Adrian. For those of you you don't know Adrian or don't know National Shelter, Adrian, do you want to just give us a quick rundown on what National Shelter is and does?
Okay, so we're a peak body. It's a bit of a misleading title. I get lots of phone calls, especially since COVID, from homeless people looking for somewhere to stay, which is a bit unfortunate, and I have to let them know that I can't really help them. But so we're a peak body and we advocate for affordable and social housing and an end to homelessness, essentially, is what we do. So I spend a lot of my time talking to politicians, senior officials, etc., trying to convince them to build more affordable housing. We also have state shelters in every state and territory in Australia, except for Victoria. And in Victoria, our state member is the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, who keep us in touch with what happens in Victoria and help us advocate when we're down there. So that's essentially what we do. And whilst we're not having much of a win federally, there's been some good news in some of the state government budgets this year.
So the affordability crisis, people are feeling left, right and centre. From your perspective, how bad is it, and particularly for low-income people?
As bad as I've ever seen it, really. I've been doing this for nearly 40 years in one form or another, and I've not seen it as bad as it is now. House prices at one end are really out of control, inflated by any reasonable measure, but the market pays what the market pays. And at the other end, because we've underinvested in social housing for the last 30 years, we don't have enough housing for people on very low incomes. And in the middle, renters are really getting squeezed. So our rental markets all over Australia are both tight and expensive. So it's kind of a triple whammy, really. And I've not seen it this bad. So it is, if you're in a service and you're trying to find somewhere for someone to live, the reason you can't is because it's virtually impossible.
So we're going to come to what we can think about doing about all of those problems in a sec. But I've heard you speak before about just sort of the history of social housing in Australia. It's pretty interesting context just to think about, particularly when you hear current debates about what state or federal governments should or shouldn't do or historically have or haven't done. So to rewind to say quickly, from the Second World War, what's housing policy in Australia look like?
So after the Second World War, there was a huge post-war reconstruction effort which involved a major building effort. Initially, the Commonwealth was lending money to the states to build housing to sell to people at as cheap as prices as they could. So that's where a lot of our social housing programs started, as home ownership programs for soldiers and settlers and people wanting to move out of cities and those sorts of things and expand to regions. It then reasonably quickly transferred to a rental market program, but it was largely rental housing for low-income working households rather than the sorts of programs that we see now. So it was really pitched at workers as an alternative to home ownership, so that people could have a safe, secure place that they could live in and raise families, etc. And that worked really well. In places like South Australia that had been going on for a bit longer, South Australia was once the kind of centre of social housing in Australia. It had 11% of its housing stock as social housing, and it had largely built that as a program to attract workers and manufacturing industries to South Australia, and it was really successful. Since probably the Fraser government, we have gone away from the notion of housing working households to really targeting our social housing to those most in need. So that really comes out of American philosophies, you know, started by Milton Friedman and those sorts of economists who say, oh, for a welfare state, you can only really spend money on those who really need it. If you do anything else, you're wasting taxpayers' money. So we started really targeting and narrowing the focus of our social housing programs away from a much broader focus on working households, whilst also doing the welfare stuff, to only the welfare stuff. And really that's what we've been doing for the last 30 years, is increasingly targeting our social housing to only the highest need households on the lowest incomes. Now that's had two consequences. One is that it's been a financial disaster for state housing authorities, where they just cannot get enough rental income from that to sustain what they have. And secondly, it has meant that lots of people have been locked out, and you've created communities of highly concentrated disadvantage. And that's more and more so where you have high-rise estates and very concentrated housing estates. Even Inala was once like that. It's since gone through a renewal process where a lot of it's been sold off and broken up and privatised, and that's actually improved Inala. But the real message is that we've gone away from a broader social housing system that housed a range of people to a narrow and targeted social housing system, and really that's been a failed policy. At the other end of the spectrum, we have also done things in the name of home ownership that have ended up reducing home ownership. So things like first home owner grants, any pumping up of demand side measures in our home ownership markets, which our states and federal governments have all been very keen to do on the basis of improving home ownership, have actually reduced home ownership quite massively. So we've seen a real trend of rapidly reducing levels of home ownership. Our older people still by and large are homeowners, but for anybody under 40 and for cohorts between 25 and 45, we've got the lowest levels of home ownership that we've ever seen. So the consequences moving forward for our retirement incomes and those sorts of policies are really disastrous. And it's why you are seeing increasing numbers of women, especially single older women, facing homelessness because they don't have the superannuation bank, they're probably divorced, they don't own a home, they're in the rental market. It's very expensive and hard to get into, and they often just end up sleeping in their cars or on other people's couches until the lucky ones find themselves in a community housing property or in public housing. So we've really created a range of policies which Saul Eslake describes as if you wanted to design a system that really rewarded speculation and punished the ability for people to live securely in their own homes under a whole range of tenures, then you would copy what Australia's policy mix has been.
I remember Saul Eslake gave a fantastic presentation making those sort of points, and I think he said when he asked people most commonly why they speculated in real estate, their answer was, well, to get ahead. And then he asked them, who you trying to get ahead of?
Yeah.
And it became clear to them that it was their own children. or they're friends of their own children.
That's right.
So, yeah. So what's National Shelter advocating for? How do we at least make some steps forward on all of this?
I mean, the starting point really has to be tax reform. We've got a tax system which feeds that whole speculative process, and we need to address that. Now, there's a number of ways you can do that. I'd start with addressing capital gains tax discounts for investors, because since we changed that single policy in 1999, we've seen investors pour into the market. And what they've done is, one, they've created additional competition, which has added inflationary pressure, but they've, more importantly, outcompeted would-be owner-occupiers, whether that's young families or anybody really, from the same available housing. They mostly invest in existing housing stock rather than new housing supply, so they don't actually add anything to supply, and they're really in it for quick capital gains. And once they take the capital, once they achieve the capital gains, they get out. So they've also added to a really poor quality housing market, because they're not very good at maintaining properties either. And they've fed into the whole short-term nature of rental housing, so that people can get turfed out at the drop of a hat, and are turfed out at the drop of a hat, which increases insecurity and adds cost to the people who can least afford to pay it. So that'd be the main thing I'd do at the macro level. Secondly, I think we've got to get the RBA more interested in housing affordability. There was a report released about 3 weeks ago now in Canberra called "The Elephant in the Economy." If you Google that, you'll find it, and it's all about. It actually calls for a royal commission into housing in Australia, because the policy settings have been so bad for 40 years. And it also calls on the RBA to have a much closer look at housing affordability. So that's kind of at the macro level, at the home ownership market. But the next thing is really investing in social housing. People really misunderstand the role that social housing plays to put a floor under our housing markets by protecting the most vulnerable, but also a much broader cohort of people, lower income working households. We add financial viability to that system, whether it's through state housing authorities or community housing providers, doesn't really matter. I think there's an argument now that says community housing is a better way to go, but it could be done anyway. But broadening that system and expanding social housing is the next thing that we really need to do. And people don't understand the role that affordable housing plays in productivity in the economy, in the workings of the society, and how the economy functions itself. Providing affordable housing, one, boosts jobs and provides all that economic impact, but it means that people have the ability to live and work more closely, so that they don't have productivity losses. And the gains, I think, are beginning to be understood in a productivity sense rather than a welfare sense. So pushing the notion that housing affordability isn't only about welfare, it's also about economic productivity and infrastructure. Housing really needs to be seen as infrastructure. And if we do those things and concentrate on housing people rather than endlessly providing programs which support them to be homeless, then we can potentially end homelessness. There's a particular case to be made around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing. We really need to reinvest in the community controlled Aboriginal housing sector to rebuild their capacity and allow them to house people properly. We know that community controlled services work better. Why we don't do it in housing is beyond me. The federal government has gone right away from that. And I guess the last thing that I'll mention is that the federal government needs to take responsibility. At the moment, we're in a ridiculous argument between the Commonwealth and the states, where the Commonwealth says this is a state responsibility. It flies in the face of the history that we've had Commonwealth state housing programs for 70 years now. The Commonwealth clearly has a real interest, because it provides the tax settings, it provides Commonwealth rent assistance, it does things like home builder, and it controls so many other aspects that influence housing that it can't really abrogate responsibility. But that is what they are trying to do, abrogate responsibility, and we should resist that. And we should demand that the federal government continue to maintain an interest in affordable and social housing and broaden what it does. I mean, I could go on, but those things will probably suffice.
If you've got any questions you'd like to put to Adrian, just drop them in the chat and we'll pick them up. We've got a couple of minutes left. Adrian, the housing minister in Queensland at the time believed at least that for a time during COVID, we'd managed to end rough sleeping through the emergency measures about getting people off the streets, housing them appropriately to stop the spread of COVID. Was that true? And what does it tell us about our capacity to actually do things at scale?
Probably partially true. In the first months of COVID, nearly every state and territory put enormous effort into getting rough sleepers off the streets, out of their cars, into hotels, into other temporary forms of accommodation. And that worked really well. It kept them safe. It kept the community safe. It was largely done because of the risk of them being super spreaders, if you like. And that's why they did it. We then argued that we needed then transitional policies to grab some of the available student accommodation and other forms of accommodation that had been occupied previously by migrant workers and give a 12-month option to people from that homelessness sector whilst we started to rebuild our stocks of social housing and look at longer term programs. We felt that that would have been a historic opportunity to really end homelessness. So they did the first stage of that and they didn't do the second or third stage of that. They're now stepping up in Queensland and building a lot more social housing. That was a really good measure in the last budget. But the other thing that's been happening is that people moved out of cities to regions because they could, and they could take high incomes with them into those regions and outcompete local people in those regional markets. And where normally there's a pattern of migration from the regions into the cities, that also stopped. So people stayed where they were and other people joined them, and that put enormous pressure on our regional housing markets. So whilst we've had some gains on homelessness in some areas, I suspect in the end we've had a massive lift in homelessness overall, particularly in regional Australia, because those regional markets, I mean, I live on the Sunshine Coast and the rental market around here is absolutely crazy.
It's made the news, hasn't it, just how tight it is.
Yeah, and that's the same in every regional market in the country. It's not just the Sunshine Coast, but it's everywhere. And so I think, there are going to be some long-term learnings from that. It was good to see in that Queensland budget announcement that they are thinking about Queensland's regions. Queensland is different to other states in its regional nature. It's got a lot more regions. When I ran Queensland Shelter, I always said it was actually like running a national peak because of the number of different communities that exist in Queensland and the different aspects that those regions have. So hopefully we think about that and learn from it. And there'll be some urban changes as well. Whether our CBDs ever come back in the same way, I doubt. And what does that mean for how people live, work and play, etc.? It's going to be an interesting next 5 years.
Paul's asked a question. Thanks, Paul. Do you want to come off mute and you can ask Adrian your question about negative gearing?
Hi, Adrian. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure, Paul.
Look, thanks for your presentation. Look, I worked in the homelessness sector at the start of the turn of the century, actually, and I really reflect on what you're saying. But you didn't mention negative gearing. Is there anything in that space that should be addressed?
Negative gearing should be quarantined. We'll always have negative gearing in one way, shape or form. We've had it since 1840. It started in Tasmania. Paul Keating quarantined it for a brief period of 2 years, which meant that you could only claim it against the same source of income, so only against the rental income, not against your dentist salary or some other fabulous level of income that you could have. So that really limited the impact of negative gearing. He was then convinced by the real estate industry mounting a myth campaign, really, that that was damaging rental markets and putting prices up, which actually only happened in Sydney. So there was a whole mythology around what ending negative gearing meant, or quarantining negative gearing. So I would do that, but it's unlikely that a coalition government will entertain affecting negative gearing. And it's also unlikely now that a Labor government, should they be elected, would entertain changing negative gearing because of what happened to them at the last election and the tax scare campaign. So for me, the real problem is capital gains tax. And if you can limit capital gains tax, then you take the heat out of negative gearing, which is why we advocate halving that capital gains tax discount, or looking at Ken Henry's recommendations about how to deal with capital gains tax. Because if most of the investors are being drawn in by the capital gain and the expectation of capital gain, and then you actually address the capital gains tax discount, then you're going to limit those investors to the ones who are actually in it for a smarter, longer term purpose. And we then also need to equalise the treatment between individual investors and institutional investors, so that we can actually shift from the mum and dad investment in rental housing to a much larger scale investment and rational investment in social housing, or in affordable housing, or rental housing in general. So I think you need to address negative gearing, but politically it's unlikely to happen. So I think the focus should shift to capital gains tax, and you'd effectively achieve the same thing.
Thanks, Adrian. We're out of time. Thanks for such a comprehensive and succinct survey of all things housing. So in Zoom land, clapping is done via Auslan jazz hands. So please put your hands apart for Adrian.
Thanks, Matthew. And thanks for everybody's attention.
I
will go because I've got to dash and do something else.
Thanks, Adrian.
Cheers.
Now, for today's halftime entertainment, we're pleased to throw to Rodney Greene, who's also representing Burnie as the Community of the Month a little bit later in the segment. But we're going to go to Rodney. Rodney, what have you got for us?
I'm trying to manage the technology, which was not doing as good as I expected. I want to actually show you a presentation, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll see what happens there. Can everyone see that?
No one can, but keep trying.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I can do it this way. Right, how's that? Yeah, good. So what I want to do is introduce you to a local Palawa man, Caleb Nichols Mansell. Unfortunately, he can't be with us today, but Caleb is connected to Burnie Works. He's as well as being a Pakana man, he's also founder and creative director of Black Space Creative Arts and Cultural Hub, and a self-taught digital visual artist himself. Recently, we did some rebranding of Burnie Works, and Caleb assisted in designing and developing a logo that could demonstrate our engagement with the local Aboriginal community. Around here, a feature of Tasmanian Aboriginal culture are rock carvings or petroglyphs, and we have a number of them along the coastline from from Devonport right across the Bass Strait coast and down the west coast. And they're basically rock carvings of circles with various elements to them. So what Caleb has done is taken those petroglyphs and turned them into this sort of logo and design, and it says, when Padaway works, when Burnie works. Padaway is the local Aboriginal name for Burnie. We've been really proud to be able to combine the two, the Padaway works and Burnie works together, and really show that their interrelatedness. So according to the ABC's a recent survey, only 34% of our local electorate actually know the name of the local Aboriginal group and the local land, whereas the national average is 61. And so we're really hoping that the use of the branding and sharing the story of its creation will increase, and it already has started to increase, the awareness of the name of the local Aboriginal name for our community, and has already started to strengthen relationship with our local Aboriginal community. But I'll just put it up here again because we just love the design. We like to show it. These two are stickers that can go on put on their cars and on their laptops and whatever. And the middle one is a patch that you can actually sew onto your jacket. So, so we're really proud of what Caleb's been able to do. And since we've engaged him to do this work, he's actually joined our board. So we're going to have an ongoing connection with Caleb. So, yeah, unfortunately not a sing and a dance, but I think it really shows the creativity of a local Aboriginal man.
Fantastic, Rodney. I had no idea about that petroglyph heritage and feature of Tasmania. Been your part of the world a little bit. Had no idea about that.
Yeah, it's actually been quite a significant thing because back in the 60s and 70s, the University of Tasmania actually came down and that particular rock carving was actually removed and taken to Hobart, and it's just recently been returned to the Aboriginal community.
Thanks so much, Rodney. Fascinating. We're now going to zip from one end of the country almost to the other. And Rodney, when you're ready, just stop sharing the screen. Thank you. Now to the very wonderful Pippa Bailey, who's going to tell us a little bit about what happened in the NT for ChangeFest this year. Over to you, Pippa.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And just looking at the people on this call, actually quite a lot of people engaged with ChangeFest. So I don't want to repeat too much for them, but I guess just to do the little bit of storytelling that we try and do every time we talk about ChangeFest, whoever's talking about ChangeFest, to make sure that we set it on the right tone. So obviously ChangeFest started in 2018 in Logan, and the national conveners were Logan together, working closely with Griffith University, Collaboration for Impact and Opportunity Child. And they are at the end of that event, which was beautifully disrupted by the local Indigenous community, the EOIs went out for where the next ChangeFest would be, and the next one was in Mount Druitt in 2019, and that's when I came on board. And at the same moment in 2018, an EOI was received from the Northern Territory, and so that's where it went this year. It's important to kind of tell that bit of the story because obviously between the end of 2018 and the beginning of 2020, when we started looking at ChangeFest, a lot had changed, and over the last 18 months, a lot more has changed. So we're living in this incredibly dynamic environment, and as 2018 was disrupted by the local community, 2019 was disrupted by the Sydney fires, and in many ways, 2021 was disrupted by COVID. In ways that are really obvious in terms of border closures, the Victorians couldn't come, which was deeply disappointing for them and for us, and in ways that you wouldn't necessarily imagine. So I guess that's an interesting part of the story perhaps to share here, which is that the Northern Territory, while it hasn't until very recently hadn't had any lockdowns, the local Indigenous community had really responded very quickly to COVID, in some ways much more quickly than the federal government and even the states. And a lot of remote communities had closed. And this is in 2020, obviously. After the initial lockdowns and we were starting to get back to normal, the Northern Territory government have been telling everybody else in Australia to go to the Northern Territory. So actually what that meant for me and others helping to put on ChangeFest was that there's about 10 to 15% extra people living in Darwin at the moment. There's a lot of disruption to a whole bunch of services. I had a local nurse telling me about how A&E has just been completely inundated by drunk people on the scooters that they supply in the Darwin area. And they're all the invisible ways that we don't necessarily sort of notice how COVID is having an impact, but in fact it is. So I guess what I'm kind of sharing is that it was really challenging to be putting on an event in a place that had extra people there, and also the events and indeed Larrakia Nation are just inundated with stuff to do. And that made a very, very dynamic environment, I would say, given I think we had about 10 MCs lined up and then cancel on us, and only confirmed the person who ended up doing it, Edwin Vijo, who did a fabulous job the day before. So that level of dynamic. And I guess in terms of the programming, we kind of created a disruption into this event because disruptions had already been such a strong part of ChangeFest in the past. And we had a hackathon as the kind of central middle day piece. We're still gathering a whole bunch of learnings and insights and doing an evaluation and bringing elders back together to do a First Nations evaluation. So the report will be ready in probably another month's time, but I hope that just gives you a little bit of a flavour of the challenge of putting on this year's ChangeFest. And it was fantastic also to have an online program, and just want to shout out to CMM, to Emma and Michelle, and indeed Rodney, because the Tasmanian watch party that happened, so that as part of the kind of transfer to Tasmania for the next ChangeFest, was really exciting.
Thanks so much, Pippa. And the event really has lived the national headlines, hasn't it? As you say, like Sydney bushfires, COVID. It's right. Tell you about current. It's right in there, isn't it?
Yeah.
And fantastic job for pulling it off under pretty trying circumstances again, Pippa. I'm sure you've aged a few years in the last few months, I'm sure.
That's true. I mean, I think that the other things that I'd love to flag is that I worked alongside a First Nations co-director in the new Logan and Griffith and Opportunity Child stepped away after 2019, having done a fabulous job for the first two, and NCIE, the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence, joined. So we now have Indigenous leadership at all levels. That's really exciting development, and we will build on that. So, you know, I think the joyful challenge of ChangeFest is how do we stay at the edge, at the learning edge and the cutting edge of making the change we want to see.
And the event's off to Tas and then Mildura after Tasmania, is it right?
Indeed.
Fantastic, that's exciting. Thanks so much, Pippa. Jazz hands for Pippa. Okay, now this next item is to give you a chance to chat very quickly to each other. What we're trying to do is build some connective tissue across the land from community to community and person to person. So Michelle's going to pop you into probably 2 breakout rooms, I think. Michelle looks about right. Your task is a very simple one, is if you all know each other, or you can go make a cup of tea. If you don't know each other, introduce yourself and have a quick conversation about who you are and what you do and why you're here. It's as simple as that. There's no other work. Just get to know each other. Now, I reckon we've got about 6 or 7 minutes, and then we're back to Rodney for Community of the Month, which is Burnie. So off you go. Have a good chat, 6 or 7 minutes. Do as much introducing as you can in the next 6 or 7 minutes. Off you go, Michelle. Thanks.
Great. See you all soon.
That voice doesn't sound like yours, Michelle. Incredible how you do that. Very good. Well, hopefully you've all had a bit of a chat and met someone that you didn't already know. Our last segment for today is our Community of the Month segment, and this month it is the fabulous Burnie and Rodney Greene. Rodney, welcome again. Firstly, tell us a bit about Burnie. Where is it? How big is it? What's it like?
Okay, so Burnie is on the northwest coast of Tasmania. It's a town of about 20,000 people. Very industrial focus. It used to have a large pulp and paper mill, but which closed back in the 1990s and early 2000s. So it was very much a company town for a long time, and heavy industry, but that's changed over the last 10, 15 years to much more advanced manufacturing, food processing, and a lot of those sort of new industries.
And Burnie Works is probably one of the oldest established place-based projects in Australia. Maybe not the oldest, but pretty close. How did Burnie Works happen? And tell us a bit about it.
Okay, so Burnie Works came out of the Better Futures Local Solutions program that was started by the Gillard government back in the day. There was a local advisory group that was part of that program that was brought together, and a government action leader and a community action leader. That was they were doing the backbone functions. But that funding was pulled almost about halfway through the program by a new government. But the local advisory group went to council and said, look, we're learning a lot about collective impact. We think it's a great way to work. We believe that we need to continue it. And council agreed and established what became the local enabling group, which supported the work of a number of working groups that have been established under the Burnie Works name. And for a long time it was unfunded. For about 5 years was unfunded. And then a couple of years ago, we were invited to become part of the Stronger Places, Stronger People initiative. So we're sort of going from strength to strength at the moment because we've now got some resource for the backbone team.
And what are some of the focus topics or focus areas or projects that you're up to?
Yeah, okay, so we have a number of focus areas. We're slightly different in our approach to collective impact to a lot of other communities in that our community didn't pick one issue and then applied the collective impact framework. It found the collective impact framework and said, this is the way we want to work, and have applied it to a number of different issues. So we have focus areas in education, employment, justice, families, first 1,000 days, local drug action team, and a health and wellbeing group. So yeah, it's very, very broad. Each of those focus areas have working groups, and then there are some projects that we do at sort of whole initiative level.
It's always really impressed me just how sort of the depth of embrace of that common methodology, collective impact, that you always reflected. So how did that get achieved? That's something that many of us, would love, is to have so many of our stakeholders really knowledgeable and working with the same methodology and the same language, etc. How did that happen?
Lots of hard work. Look, funnily enough, I think it comes naturally for communities. So working groups that have a lot of community members really get collective impact. And in fact, they're surprised that it's not the way of working amongst services. We hear that a lot. It's more, but the working groups that have much more of a social service background, service providers, are the ones that we had to work really hard to get on board. But what we did was, rather than sit around and talk about it, we actually said, right, let's come up with a project that we can see collective impact in practice and in action and do it. So we had some early projects that had a collective impact approach, and the group used to meet monthly. Most of the service providers in town used to meet monthly. They would spend only the first quarter of the meeting talking about the actual project, And the rest of the time was talking about what are we learning about the ways of working? What are we learning about collective impact? And now it's pretty much become a sort of a fairly standard way of working in Burnie.
And your origins out of local government, not exclusively obviously, but with a strong role for local government. It's interesting how all our initiatives start. Some of them, like Logan Together, is a strong local government origin with many other origins as well, but there was a strong local government origin. What have you found as the pluses and minuses of coming out of a local government frame?
Yeah. So the pluses, I think, is that it brings a much broader community approach. And I guess because I was the Director of Community and Economic Development at Council for 15, 16 years, so you get to know the community pretty well in that role. So I was doing the sort of role of systems leader for Burnie Works off the side of my desk for a number of years. So by having council being involved, it does give you that sort of real depth of engagement with the community. And I think the other thing that it gave us was that sense of neutrality, particularly when you're working with service providers. You know, there's a lot of a few turf wars that exist sometimes, and we really found that people really appreciated that sort of a neutral body like council being able to facilitate the work. The negatives are because we've just come out of council 2 weeks ago, so we're now an independent organisation. I would say that you're very much, people identify you as council rather than as an initiative. And so if there's something is going wrong with council or community perceive there's something wrong with council, you get tarred with that. We've just got our council is just going through a bit of a restructure, and it's just basically dissolved what was my Department of Community and Economic Development. So, you know, made about basically almost everyone redundant, and has said they're not delivering community development services anymore. So we were just lucky, I guess it was really fortuitous that we were on the way out of council and establishing our own identity. Otherwise, I think it would have been really to be caught up in the negative reaction from the community to council's sort of change in direction would have been, I think, would have really undermined the work that we're trying to do.
Once again, if you've got a question for Rodney, just drop it in the chat, or if that's hard, just yell out and we'll get your question to Rodney. So please do that if there's something on your mind. But it just goes to that question that many of us wrestle with, particularly for initiatives that have been established for a long time, is the sort of the waxing and waning of fortunes, really, of these ways of working. And it sounds like you've had a couple of peak moments and some trough moments. How have you managed to sustain the enthusiasm now, what, 7 or 8, 9 years down the track?
Yep, that's a good question. I don't feel like the enthusiasm has changed too much. I guess because we've got we've got so many focus areas and working groups, there's always an energy in one of the working groups. So as one wanes, another one is really taking off. So that really helps us. And I think it's, you know, the necessity of the work requires you to have a really long-term focus. It's, you know, you've just got to go with the flow and take the punches on some days, and just recognise that this is a 20-year project. If we're going to, before we really start to see the really good, great outcomes. But of course, you're always seeing, you know, those, what we refer to green shoots. We talk a lot about just, you know, the small wins, recognising the champions that come along. So we do, yeah, we try to celebrate as much as we can.
Paul's got another question. Thanks, Paul, for chipping in.
I know it'll be a tough one, Paul. I can already feel it.
Thanks, Rodney. Evaluation or data collection. You know, show me the evidence. How do you grapple with that, and how do you talk to funding bodies about stuff that's often difficult to pin down?
Yeah, that's a good question. And look, we were really, evaluation is by its nature very intensive, and you need a lot of resource to do it. Because we've got the Stronger Places funding now, we've actually got a full-time evaluation officer. But we also have just reviewed our theory of change for what is the impact that collective impact has, and realised that that we need to do some more work with that, which we've done, and understand the role of amplification. Collective impact is about amplifying the work that's already happening. It's not about doing a whole heap of new initiatives or replacing what's already there. It's about amplifying the work by working together, collaboration, bringing in systems change, place-based approaches, etc. So in terms of evaluation, there are things that we've learned. One is that we need to have much more of a focus on process tracing, which is a methodology that supports that sort of, particularly around attribution and contribution to the work. It's because we have so many stakeholders and there's such complexity, there's a need to be really clear on what is it that we're claiming that collective impact contributes to. And the other thing is, I guess, it means that we have to have really good data to do that, both qualitative and quantitative. Getting quantitative, the type of quantitative data that we need is always difficult to get out of governments. It's not always the best, the best reading, but our argument to government is if they allow communities to take some responsibility, then it reduces the risk for them of releasing some of that data. So there's that, and then it's also about the qualitative and data, and that's about how do we engage with the community and collect the voice of the community to be able to really have the stories that brings the data to life. And so we're working on a little project at the moment around raising up storytellers who will be able to collect the stories and contribute to the evaluation.
Thanks, Rodney. Thanks, Paul, for the great question. We're almost at time. And so after one or two more questions for Rodney, we're going to ask for anyone who'd like to volunteer to be Community of the Month next month in August. So have a think about that. And we'll get to that in a second. But Rodney, again, one of the questions that I think's really valuable to hear your reflections on, having been on this journey for such a long time, is how do you keep yourself going? The role of the backbone leader is a challenging one. There's burnout, and you've been at it for probably as long as anyone that I know. How do you keep yourself going?
Yeah, that's a good question, Matthew. I think it's about having some colleagues who you can share the journey with, and we've started to develop a close relationship with a number of communities around Australia, and that's really helpful. I think though that it helps to, like I said before, it's about having that long-term perspective, but also identifying the green shoots and celebrating those. So, someone asked me this the other day. I feel as energised as ever, we've just done a relaunch of Burnie Works, and we've I think we're creating more of a movement. So it's not just the group service providers and interested people working together. It's now becoming a community movement, and I think that's really exciting. So, I think it's there's a lot of things that contribute to it, but I think I need to think about that and reflect on that a little more. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Rodney. Would everyone join me thanking Rodney Greene?
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rodney. I'm sure you wouldn't mind taking questions or visits from people. So we'll get Rodney's email contact out to you all. So we're at time. So here we go. Any volunteers for Community of the Month for August? Don't all rush, but put your hands up or drop your name in the chat. I'll give everyone a minute to feel uncomfortable before someone cracks and volunteers. Megan, you're smiling quite a lot. Does that mean you're volunteering?
I don't actually work in a collective impact initiative in a community. I'm sort of part of an organisation that supports other initiatives, but I thought perhaps I could share this out within the Connected Beginnings network to see if people want to join and possibly self-nominate. I wouldn't want to do that on their behalf. I might get in trouble.
Lovely. All right, we got any takers immediately, or we'll have to rustle one up outside this meeting? Okay, we'll rustle one up. Thanks so much. We'll see if we can get a bit of a bigger crowd, because it's such an interesting discussion and the quality of the sharing is just really high. So let's, if we could give you all a bit of homework, see if you can do exactly what Megan just said and rustle up a bit of a bigger crowd for August. A few important thanks. ChangeMakers on Tuesdays is brought to you by the Australia Together Alliance, and Laura Barnes, who's on the line, is the convener. So thanks to Australia Together partners. And that's made possible with the support of DSS, who are doing, or supporting a lot of the back end, which is brought to you by Collaboration for Impact. And thanks for the fantastic job Michelle Wigg does on keeping us all on track. So next time is the 10th of August. It's the second Tuesday of every month, 10th of August, 12:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time to 12:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time next Tuesday, the 10th of August, second Tuesday of the month. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, Michelle's going to leave the call open for 10 minutes. If anyone wants to hang around and have more of a chat, you're most welcome to. But from me, I'm going to sign off, and we'll see you all next month, I hope. And tell your friends, tell your friends.
Thanks for
everyone.
hosting, Matthew.